The first thing you should know about suburban HOAs is that they love rules until the rules belong to someone else. The morning it all started, the smell of wet clay and cedar drifted across my family's land just outside Austin, Texas, and 35 brand new houses sat quietly in the valley below my grandfather's old dam. Perfect lawns, identical mailboxes, fresh asphalt roads that curved neatly around cul-de-sacs with cheerful names like Willow Court and Heritage Drive. From a distance, it looked like the American dream. Up close, it was something else entirely, because every single one of those houses had been built on land that legally belonged to me. My name is Ethan Walker, and 3 months before that morning, I had just returned from my second deployment overseas working as a water infrastructure engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers. After years of dust, concrete barriers, and the constant hum of generators and desert heat, all I wanted was quiet. 47 acres of rolling Texas pasture that my grandfather bought back in 1955. A small cattle pond. An old wooden fence that leaned just enough to show its age. And the earth dam my grandfather built in 1978. A simple structure of packed clay and limestone designed to catch rainwater during dry hill country summers. I grew up fishing in that pond, my boots crunching gravel beside my grandfather as he explained how water moves across land like it has a memory. Water always follows the truth, he used to say, tapping the dirt with the handle of his shovel. You can slow it down. You can guide it. But you can't lie to it. Standing on top of that dam now, the wind brushing across the tall grass, I could hear the distant whine of lawn mowers from the neighborhood below. 35 houses, each one probably worth close to $2 million. 2-story stone facades, backyard patios, blue swimming pools that shimmered under the Texas sun. All built while I was thousands of miles away. The strange part wasn't just the construction. It was the way it had happened. No letters. No phone calls. No survey flags that I ever saw. Just one day returning home and discovering that the southern half of my land had quietly transformed into a master-planned suburban development called Willow Creek Estates. The first time I drove down there, the tires of my truck crackling over fresh pavement, a woman in a bright tennis outfit rolled toward me in a white golf cart like she owned the entire valley. Margaret Caldwell, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Perfect hair, expensive sunglasses, the kind of polite smile that feels sharp around the edges. She didn't even bother asking who I was. She just looked at my dusty truck, then at my boots, and said something I still remember word for word. "You must be the neighbor," she told me sweetly. "Don't worry. The HOA already handled the land issue." Handled the land issue. Those 4 words hung in the air heavier than the August humidity. I didn't say anything at the time. I just drove back up the hill toward my grandfather's dam, the gravel popping under my tires, my mind turning over every possibility. Because Maggie Caldwell and her brand new HOA had made one very expensive assumption. They believed the land below that dam belonged to them now. What they didn't know was that the dam itself, and the water behind it, still belonged to me. I did not argue with Maggie Caldwell that afternoon. I remember the heat rolling off the pavement in slow waves and the distant buzz of cicadas in the oak trees as her golf cart idled beside my truck. Up close, she smelled like expensive perfume mixed with the faint sweetness of sunscreen, the kind people wear when they expect to spend long afternoons by a country club pool. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had never once been told no in her life. According to her, the situation had already been resolved months ago through something she called a routine property consolidation. Her HOA had filed paperwork, the county had approved zoning changes, and developers had moved in to transform and used ranch land into a thriving residential community. She said the words "in used ranch land" the way someone might describe an abandoned parking lot, not the same ground where my grandfather had taught me to mend fences and check water levels after summer storms. I let her finish. Then I drove away without another word, because there is a moment in every conversation when you realize the other person has absolutely no idea what they are talking about. The gravel road that led back toward the dam curved through tall grass and mesquite trees that had grown there longer than Willow Creek Estates had even existed. The tires of my truck crunched slowly over limestone rock, the sound steady and familiar, and for the first time since returning home I started to notice how different the land felt. Fresh tire tracks from construction equipment cut across the lower pasture. Survey stakes poked out of the dirt like bright orange flags. Someone had even rerouted the narrow creek that fed my grandfather's pond, pushing the water through a new drainage pipe that disappeared beneath the neighborhood's entrance road. That was when the quiet anger began settling into something colder and more focused. Because my grandfather had always been careful with his paperwork. Back in 1978, when he built the dam, he did not just move dirt and stack limestone by instinct. He worked with county engineers. He filed permits. He kept records in thick manila folders that smelled faintly of dust and old ink. I knew exactly where those folders were stored. Inside the small tool shed beside the dam, there was a rusted metal cabinet that had been sitting in the same spot since I was a kid. The door creaked when I pulled it open, and a warm smell of aged paper drifted into the air. Sunlight slipped through the wooden slats of the shed walls, lighting up stacks of survey maps, inspection reports, and yellowing envelopes covered in my grandfather's careful handwriting. I sat down on an overturned bucket and began flipping through them slowly while the wind rustled through the cedar trees outside. Most people think land ownership is simple. A deed, a fence line, maybe a handshake between neighbors. But water changes everything. Water has its own rules, its own history, its own chain of rights that can stretch back more than a century. About 20 minutes into that stack of documents, I found the first clue. It was a folded permit stamped by the Army Corps of Engineers confirming the dam's construction and the legal water management authority tied to it. The paper felt thin and brittle between my fingers, but the language printed across it was still perfectly clear. Federal jurisdiction over water retention and downstream flow control. I leaned back against the shed wall, listening to the soft trickle of water moving through the spillway outside. Down in the valley, lawn mowers continued buzzing across. Brand new grass. 35 houses. Perfect sidewalks. Families probably unpacking boxes and hanging curtains without the slightest idea that the quiet pond above them was not just a piece of scenery. It was a system, and systems follow rules whether people notice them or not. I returned to the dam the next morning just after sunrise, when the Texas Hill Country is quiet enough that you can hear the wind moving through the cedar branches like a slow whisper across the land. The pond behind the dam looked the same as it had my entire life. A calm sheet of water reflecting the pale orange sky, while a pair of ducks drifted lazily near the reeds. If you stood there long enough, you could almost forget that 35 brand new houses now filled the valley below. But the sound of distant garage doors opening carried up the hill with the morning breeze, followed by the faint hum of coffee grinders and car engines starting their daily commute. Willow Creek Estates was waking up. I sat on the tailgate of my truck with the stack of old permits and maps spread across the metal beside me, studying them again in the early light. My grandfather believed paperwork was just as important as fences. Every survey line was marked, every permit stamped, every inch of water management carefully documented in thick legal language that most people would never bother reading. But the more I looked at those documents, the more obvious the problem became. Whoever built that neighborhood had not ignored the paperwork by accident. They had simply assumed nobody would check. Around 9 o'clock that morning, I drove down into the subdivision again. The streets still smelled like fresh asphalt warming under the sun, and sprinklers ticked rhythmically across small front lawns that had been planted only weeks earlier. Willow Creek Estates looked like a brochure for perfect suburban life. Stone mailboxes, decorative street lamps, a small playground where 2 young kids were already arguing over whose turn it was to use the swing. I rolled slowly toward the neighborhood clubhouse where a line of white columns framed a glass entrance door, and right there beside the parking lot sat Maggie Caldwell's white sport utility vehicle, shining like it had just come from a dealership showroom. She stepped out onto the sidewalk the moment she saw my truck. Pull up. Perfect posture. Sunglasses pushed up onto her hair. The same smooth smile she had worn the day before. She greeted me like a hostess welcoming someone into a country club. According to Maggie, Willow Creek Estates was a model community designed to increase property values throughout the region. Families were moving in from Dallas and Houston. The development had county approval. The land consolidation had already been processed through legal channels months ago while I was overseas. She spoke quickly and confidently, pointing toward the houses like a real estate agent giving a grand tour. She even mentioned how the small lake above the hill added natural beauty to the neighborhood views. That part made me pause, because the lake she was talking about was not a lake at all. It was a controlled reservoir sitting behind a dam that had very specific operational rules attached to it. When she finished explaining the success of her community project, she looked at me with the same polite expression and said something that revealed exactly how little she understood about the land beneath her subdivision. She told me the water above the hill would make a beautiful feature for future property listings. A scenic overlook perhaps. Maybe even paddle boats someday. I remember the wind moving across the dry grass between us while she said it. I remember the faint sound of water trickling through the spillway pipe high above the valley. And I remember realizing that Maggie Caldwell had spent months building an entire neighborhood without ever once asking the most important question about the property she thought she owned. She had never asked who controlled the water. I left the neighborhood that morning with Maggie Caldwell's words still echoing in my head, the steady rumble of my truck engine mixing with the dry Texas wind as I climbed the gravel road back toward the dam. Below me, the neat rows of houses glowed in the late morning sun like something out of a real estate commercial. Sprinklers clicked across fresh sod. A delivery truck rolled slowly through the main gate. Everything about Willow Creek Estates looked permanent, settled, like it had always belonged there. But land has a long memory, and this land remembered something different. When I parked beside the dam again, the air smelled faintly of wet clay and cedar bark warming under the heat. The water behind the earthen wall stretched quietly across nearly 3 acres, smooth and reflective except for the slow ripple where the spillway pipe released a narrow stream downhill. I walked along the top of the dam the same way my grandfather used to, boots pressing into the packed dirt that had been holding water back for more than 4 decades. He had built it carefully, not just for cattle, but to regulate the seasonal runoff that rolled down from the limestone hills during heavy rainstorms. In this part of Texas, water does not simply appear when you want it. It comes fast, sometimes violently, and if you do not manage it correctly, it will carve new paths through the land whether you approve or not. That was the entire reason the Army Corps of Engineers had inspected the structure when it was built. They wanted to make sure the water flow could be controlled safely for every property downstream. Standing there again, I could see exactly where that downstream path now led. 35 rooftops set directly in the drainage basin. Driveways, back patios, fences. The entire development had been placed in the natural flood channel that the dam was designed to regulate. Whoever approved the construction had either ignored the original engineering plans or never looked at them at all. That realization stayed with me the rest of the afternoon while I reviewed the documents again inside the small shed. The paperwork confirmed everything I suspected. The dam was registered with federal oversight for water retention and seasonal release control. Any adjustment to the water level required proper documentation, inspection records, and operational logs. It was not just a pond behind a hill. It was a managed water structure with a defined drainage path that existed long before Willow Creek Estates appeared on any county zoning map. Late that evening, I drove into town and stopped at the county records office, a low brick building that smelled like old carpet and printer ink. The clerk behind the counter looked half asleep until I mentioned the property address tied to the dam permit. Within a few minutes, she pulled up the development records for Willow Creek Estates on her computer. What she showed me was almost impressive in its confidence. The zoning change had been approved during a single council session while I was still overseas. The developer's paperwork described the lower pasture as vacant agricultural land with no active infrastructure affecting construction. No mention of the dam. No mention of the water management permit. Just a simple note stating that natural drainage would be handled through neighborhood stormwater systems. I drove back home after sunset with the windows down and the warm smell of dry grass filling the truck. From the top of the hill, the neighborhood lights shimmered across the valley like a grid of tiny stars. Families were settling in. Televisions flickered through living room windows. Somewhere a dog barked behind a brand new wooden fence. It looked peaceful, safe, permanent. But as I stood beside the dam listening to the slow whisper of water moving through the spillway pipe, I could not stop thinking about something my grandfather once told me during a heavy storm when I was 10 years old. He had pointed toward the valley and said the same quiet sentence that had stayed in my head for years. Water always finds the path it was meant to follow. The next morning, the sky over the valley was clear and bright, the kind of wide Texas blue that makes the limestone hills look almost silver in the sunlight. I woke before sunrise out of habit from deployment and stepped outside with a cup of black coffee, the air still cool enough to carry the smell of damp grass and cedar bark drifting down from the ridge. From the porch, I could see the top of the dam cutting across the hill like a quiet line drawn through the land. Beyond it, the valley was waking up again. Cars rolled slowly through Willow Creek Estates as people left for work. Garage doors lifted one by one. A school bus stopped at the corner near the neighborhood entrance while a few kids waited with backpacks hanging from their shoulders. It looked calm, predictable, exactly the way suburban life is supposed to look. But every time I watched that neighborhood, now my eyes followed the same invisible path. The drainage channel. The long, shallow valley floor that stretched from the base of my dam straight through the center of the subdivision. That was the path the water had followed for centuries before anyone poured a single sidewalk down there. After finishing my coffee, I drove back into town again and spent the better part of the morning inside the county records office reviewing every permit tied to Willow Creek Estates. The building smelled like old paper and air conditioning filters, the quiet kind of place where fluorescent lights buzz overhead and nobody raises their voice above a polite whisper. Page after page confirmed the same thing. The developers had moved fast. Too fast. Zoning adjustments. Land consolidation filings. Environmental impact statements that looked suspiciously thin for a project of that size. The paperwork described the lower valley as stable development ground with minimal natural water risk. But the original dam permit from 1978 said something very different. According to the engineering report, the valley below the dam served as the designated overflow corridor during seasonal release events. In simple terms, it meant that the land below the reservoir was never supposed to hold permanent structures without serious drainage planning. Whoever approved the subdivision had ignored that completely. By late afternoon, I had copies of every document stacked neatly in a thick envelope beside me as I drove back toward the ranch. The sunlight was lower now, casting long golden shadows across the grass as the road curved up toward the dam. When I reached the top of the hill, I parked the truck and walked slowly along the earthen ridge again. The reservoir behind the dam stretched quiet and steady, reflecting the clouds like a sheet of glass. The spillway pipe released its usual narrow stream of water, the soft trickling sound blending with the wind rustling through tall grass. Down in the valley, the neighborhood lights began flickering on one by one as evening settled over Willow Creek Estates. Families were probably sitting down for dinner. Someone was grilling on a backyard patio. The peaceful hum of normal life carried faintly up the hill. I leaned against the wooden railing near the control gate and studied the mechanism my grandfather installed decades ago. The metal wheel felt cool and solid under my hand, the same way it had felt the first time he showed it to me when I was a kid. Back then he explained how every structure like this had a purpose. Dams were not built to stop water forever. They were built to control it, release it slowly, protect the land downstream when storms came through the hill country. Standing there now with the wind moving gently across the water, I finally understood the full shape of the problem Maggie Caldwell and her developers had created. They had built an entire neighborhood in the one place that water was always meant to travel. And sooner or later, every system demands that its rules be followed. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly over the next few days like the quiet shift in weather you feel before a storm moves across the hill country. Each morning, I walked the ridge of the dam with a clipboard and a stack of documents from the county office, reviewing every line of the permits the same way my grandfather used to check fence posts after a long winter. The more I studied those papers, the clearer the picture became. Willow Creek Estates had not just been built on my land. It had been built directly inside a federally documented drainage basin that existed decades before the first foundation was poured. By the third day, I drove south toward the regional office of the Army Corps of Engineers, a plain government building surrounded by live oak trees and gravel parking lots. The lobby smelled like coffee and printer toner, the familiar scent of federal offices everywhere. I handed the clerk a copy of the dam permit from 1978 and explained that a new residential development had appeared in the downstream corridor tied to the structure. Within minutes, her expression changed from routine politeness to something closer to concern. She disappeared down a hallway with the paperwork while I sat in a plastic chair listening to the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. When she returned, she was accompanied by an engineer named Daniel Harper, a tall man in his late 40s who carried a tablet filled with survey maps. We spent nearly an hour reviewing the original design of the dam and the natural runoff channel below it. According to the federal records, the reservoir behind my property was classified as a regulated water retention feature tied to seasonal flood management across the valley. That meant every release of water through the spillway followed a documented schedule designed to maintain safe levels within the reservoir. Harper zoomed in on the satellite map of the area and slowly traced the path of the drainage corridor with his finger. The blue line ran straight through the center of Willow Creek Estates like a quiet secret hiding beneath the neighborhood streets. He leaned back in his chair and said something that made the entire situation feel even more surreal. From a regulatory perspective, the dam was operating exactly as designed. The only problem was that a housing development had been placed directly inside the downstream release zone without accounting for the structure that controlled the water above it. The engineer did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. He simply explained the rules. If the reservoir ever approached its maximum safe capacity, the operator of the dam was required to release water through the spillway to maintain structural safety. That responsibility belonged to the property owner listed on the permit. In this case, the name printed on the document was mine. I drove back to the ranch that afternoon with the windows down and warm wind rushing through the cab of the truck. The sun hung low over the limestone hills, painting the valley in long streaks of gold as Willow Creek Estates came into view again below the dam. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. A couple walked their dog past the entrance sign decorated with fresh landscaping stones. It looked like the picture of quiet suburban life. But now when I studied the layout of the streets, I could see exactly where the natural water path crossed the development. Every driveway, every yard, every cul-de-sac had been placed in the same corridor that the engineers documented decades earlier. When I reached the top of the hill, I stepped out of the truck and listened to the gentle trickle of water moving through the spillway pipe beside the dam. The reservoir behind me was calm, reflecting the late afternoon sky like a mirror. I rested my hand on the metal wheel that controlled the release gate and looked down at the valley once more. Maggie Caldwell and her developers had built their perfect neighborhood without ever noticing the one system that had always controlled that land. And systems, sooner or later, follow the rules they were built for. The plan did not begin with anger. It began with patience. The kind my grandfather used whenever something on the ranch needed fixing properly instead of quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, I did exactly what the federal engineer recommended. I documented everything. Every measurement of the reservoir level. Every inspection record of the dam. Every rainfall report across the watershed that fed the small lake behind the ridge. The air during those days carried the dry smell of late summer grass and warm limestone dust, the same steady Texas heat that makes the land look calm even when something important is shifting beneath the surface. Each morning, I walked along the dam with a measuring stick and clipboard, recording the water level the way the original permit required. The numbers slowly climbed higher after a pair of steady rainstorms rolled across the hills west of the ranch. Nothing dramatic. Just a few inches each day as runoff collected behind the earthen wall. Down in Willow Creek Estates, life continued exactly the way Maggie Caldwell had imagined when she sold everyone on the idea of a perfect neighborhood. Lawn care trucks moved from house to house, trimming fresh sod. Delivery vans stopped beside stone mailboxes. One evening, I watched a group of neighbors gathering near the community entrance sign while children chased each other across the small park lawn. The soft echo of laughter drifted up the valley with the breeze. It was strange watching them from the ridge because none of them had any idea how the land above them actually worked. They saw the lake behind the hill as scenery. Something peaceful to photograph during sunset. But the reservoir was never meant to sit full forever. Its entire purpose was controlled movement. The system my grandfather built depended on one simple rule written clearly in the federal permit. When the water level reached the upper safety threshold, the operator was required to begin a regulated release through the spillway. That rule existed long before Willow Creek Estates appeared on any map. Late one afternoon, I drove down into the subdivision again, carrying copies of the inspection records and rainfall reports. Maggie Caldwell met me outside the clubhouse with the same confident posture she always wore, her white sport utility vehicle parked nearby, like a symbol of permanent authority. I calmly explained that the reservoir above the neighborhood was approaching the level where controlled release procedures would begin according to the original dam permit. She listened with an expression that slowly shifted from polite curiosity to thinly veiled irritation. According to Maggie, the neighborhood stormwater system was designed to handle any natural runoff from the hills. She said the developers had assured her the drainage infrastructure met county standards. Her tone suggested the matter was already settled, and that my concern was simply unnecessary worry from someone unfamiliar with modern development. I did not argue. I simply handed her the printed copy of the federal permit that outlined the dam's operational rules and pointed to the section describing mandatory spillway release once the reservoir reached capacity. The paper rustled lightly in the wind as she glanced over it without much interest. When she handed it back, she gave the same small confident smile she had used since the first day we met. According to her, the neighborhood would be just fine. The houses were built on elevated lots. The drainage system was brand new. Everything had been approved through proper channels. I nodded once, folded the permit back into my folder, and drove up the hill again as evening shadows stretched across the valley. From the top of the dam, I could see the neighborhood lights beginning to glow one by one beneath the fading sky. The reservoir behind me had climbed another inch since the morning measurement. I stood beside the control while listening to the slow, steady whisper of water passing through the narrow spillway pipe and thought about something the Army Corps engineer told me before I left his office. The system was not emotional. It did not care about zoning meetings or homeowners associations or real estate promises. It only followed the design written into its structure decades earlier. And the water level was still rising. 3 days later, the reservoir reached the number written in the original permit. I noticed it the moment I stepped onto the dam just after sunrise, when the air was still cool and the smell of wet clay drifted across the ridge. The water behind the earthen wall had climbed to the final mark etched into the old measuring post my grandfather installed decades ago. It was not dramatic. The surface looked calm and quiet, reflecting a pale orange sky while a few slow ripples moved across the lake. But the number on that post meant something very specific. According to the federal operating rules, the reservoir had reached its upper safety threshold. At that point, the dam operator was required to begin a controlled spillway release to maintain structural safety and proper water flow through the valley below. I checked the measurement twice, just the way my grandfather taught me. Then I wrote the number in the inspection log and noted the time of day. The wind moved gently through the tall grass along the ridge while the valley below began waking up again. From that height, I could see the entire neighborhood spreading across the drainage basin. Morning sunlight bounced off kitchen windows. A few cars rolled slowly out of driveways as people left for work. Someone walked a golden retriever along the sidewalk near the community park. Everything looked peaceful. Routine. The same calm suburban rhythm Maggie Caldwell had promised everyone when the houses were built. I stood beside the metal control wheel for a moment, listening to the faint trickle of water already slipping through the narrow spillway pipe. The system had been releasing a small amount of water all week as the reservoir climbed. But now the permit required something different. A full regulated release to return the lake to its normal operating level. I pulled the inspection binder from the truck and flipped to the page where the procedure was outlined in careful federal language. Step 1 required verifying the water measurement. Step 2 required documenting the release event. Step 3 involved adjusting the spillway gate to begin a gradual increase in downstream flow. Nothing about the process was sudden. It was simply the system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The metal will turned slowly under my hands, the mechanism creaking softly as the gate lifted a few inches inside the concrete channel. A deeper stream of water began moving through the spillway pipe, sliding downhill toward the valley in a steady, controlled current. The sound changed immediately. What had been a quiet trickle became a strong, rushing flow echoing against the limestone rocks below the dam. I stepped back and watched the water move away through the natural drainage path that had existed long before any houses appeared there. Down in Willow Creek Estates, the neighborhood continued its normal morning routine. A landscaping truck rolled along the curb near the entrance sign. A garage door opened beside one of the larger homes near the center of the development. Nobody down there noticed the small creek widening at the far edge of the property where the drainage channel crossed the subdivision. From the dam, the movement looked almost graceful as the water followed its original route through the valley floor. It passed beneath the decorative bridge the developers built near the park. It curved gently along the low ground behind several backyards. And it continued spreading across the natural basin that engineers had mapped decades earlier. The release was not chaotic. It was not unexpected. It was simply water returning to the path it had always followed. By late morning, the reservoir behind the dam had begun dropping slowly toward its normal level again. I leaned against the wooden railing and watched the valley below, while the steady sound of flowing water filled the air. Somewhere down in the neighborhood, a car alarm chirped briefly before falling silent again. Life in Willow Creek Estates was still moving along as usual, but the land beneath those streets had quietly remembered its original design, and the system my grandfather built was now doing exactly what it had always been meant to do. By late afternoon, the reservoir had dropped nearly 8 inches from the morning measurement, exactly the way the original engineering plan predicted. The steady rush of water moving through the spillway echoed softly across the ridge, while warm Texas sunlight stretched long shadows across the hills. From the top of the dam, I could see the entire valley clearly. Willow Creek Estates no longer looked quite as calm and predictable as it had the day Maggie Caldwell first greeted me with her confident smile. The natural drainage basin had begun to reveal itself. Along the low ground near the back edges of several properties, a shallow sheet of water now followed the old runoff corridor that engineers documented decades earlier. It moved slowly and steadily, exactly as the system intended, spreading across the lowest portions of the valley floor before continuing downhill toward the natural creek bed beyond the neighborhood. Nothing about it was sudden or uncontrolled. It was simply the land doing what land has always done when water returns to its original path. I remained on the dam through most of the afternoon, recording measurements in the inspection log as the reservoir gradually settled back toward its normal operating level. The smell of fresh grass drifted up from the valley as lawn crews paused their work and watched the widening stream near the park bridge. A few residents gathered along the sidewalk, pointing toward the water that now moved quietly beneath the decorative archway the developers installed during construction. From a distance, their conversations sounded like faint echoes carried upward by the breeze. Sometime around 4 o'clock, a familiar white sport utility vehicle appeared near the entrance of the neighborhood and rolled slowly toward the base of the hill road. Even from that distance, I recognized the shape of Maggie Caldwell stepping out and looking up toward the dam. Her posture was no longer relaxed. She stood beside the vehicle, studying the valley floor with attention that had not been there before. The controlled spillway release continued exactly according to the permit procedure. Water flowed through the drainage basin, past backyards and sidewalks that had been placed directly along the valley's lowest contour. By early evening, the stream began narrowing again as the reservoir returned closer to its standard level. The system was stabilizing just as the engineers designed it to do 45 years earlier. When the sun dipped low behind the limestone hills, the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one across Willow Creek Estates. Families stood outside talking quietly near their driveways while the last thin ribbon of water followed the basin toward the natural creek downstream. I closed the inspection binder and rested my hand on the cool metal railing beside the control wheel. The lake behind the dam had settled into its familiar calm surface once again, reflecting the deep orange sky while evening wind rippled gently across the water. Down in the valley, Maggie Caldwell's neighborhood looked smaller now somehow, its neat rows of houses resting quietly along the same land that had guided water long before any of them were built. My grandfather used to say that land never forgets its purpose. Standing there in the fading light with the sound of water slowly fading back into silence, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The system had followed its rules. The land had followed its memory.